Hi everyone, tarekith here, and today I want to talk about the Teenage Engineering OP-1 field. This isn't going to be a full-on review covering all the features and functionality of the OP-1 field. For all intents and purposes, the workflow and functionality is identical to the original OP-1 that came out 8-9 years ago, and I've already covered that in my original review of the first OP-1. So if you're curious about how things are organized, how it's laid out, how it works, I'll link my original review down in the description below. You can go ahead and watch that. Today I'm just going to be talking about the new field version, what's good, what's bad, what I like, what I don't like, should you buy it, all that kind of fun stuff. A bit of background, as most of you know, I like portable devices for making music, groove boxes, things like that. I love being out in the woods to write and perform my music. So when the original OP-1 came out, I was super interested in it and was one of the early adopters. I think like a lot of people, I kind of judged a book by its cover, and just based on the way it looks, sort of like a toy, especially the original version with the bright primary colors on the knobs and whatnot. I didn't really expect a lot, and then once I got it, I was actually pleasantly surprised. There was a lot more functionality there than I expected. It was a lot of fun to use. It was just a really unique workflow that I bonded with very well. Even in the studio, everything I record gets recorded audio tracks. If I'm using, like, say, VST soft synths, those get routed right to an audio track, and I only record the audio. I don't record MIDI. So having like a 4-track audio recorder here in the OP-1 was just like a workflow I was used to, and it worked really well for me. And quite honestly, it was a lot of fun to use. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, I would go back and listen to the songs I'd been working on, and I just wasn't really happy with the overall sound quality of things. There's a lot of depth in the original OP-1. You could really finesse some nice sounds out of it, but it still had kind of a lo-fi sound. It was all mono. The keyboard you used, enter notes, wasn't velocity sensitive, so it was hard to get really expressive with it. And the build quality was just kind of so-so for me. The keys felt a little cheap, and the knobs especially felt really cheap. For like a $700-800 unit, it was passable. I don't think it was, too far off the mark what they needed to hit as far as like a price point. But once they raised the price up to like $1,300-1,400, I think it didn't hold up for me anymore. So anyway, like I said, I was really enjoying it, but just wasn't hitting the mark for what I was trying to do with my music. And at the same time, I was getting really into iOS music making, using my phone and apps like Nano Studio to create one on the go. So I ended up selling the original OP-1 about a year after I first purchased it. And there's been quite a few times since then I've regretted that decision, just because of the workflow and how much fun it was, and how there's so many limitations built into the device. You have like this walled garden to work within, and if you're okay with that, like I said, you can be really productive with it. But like I said, they raised the price to like $1,300-1,400 for the original one. I just didn't feel like it was worth it. And then last year, Teenage Engineering announced the new field version, and it seemed like all of the updates they made addressed most of my common concerns. So I took a plunge back into OP-1 land. So let's kind of get into like what's good about the new field version. As you know, if you've been following this at all over the last year or so, Teenage Engineering has announced like 100 different upgrades since the original OP-1. A lot of them are kind of bullshit, if I'm honest, like new manual and new colors for the knobs, but there's actually some genuinely useful new improvements. In fact, I'd go so far as to say is that this entire thing has been completely rebuilt from the ground up. So even though it looks the same, it feels much different. It's much higher quality. The keys feel a lot better. The knobs feel better. Everything from the ground up has been redesigned. The speaker has improved greatly. I love the new speaker. The last one was super thin, and it's usable for hearing a melody, but now you can actually get a sense of like depth and scope to your sound. It's got like 2 bass reflex ports in the bottom, they say. There's new metering for the input levels and for your main output levels. It's got much finer resolution, so it's easier to kind of dial in your levels. This is really important on the OP-1 because you can only overdub. There's no undo, so if you make a mistake while overdubbing, you might just have ruined a great take. So making sure your levels are accurate is really important, and it's much easier to do on the field version. The knobs are greatly improved as well. They have a bit more resistance to them. The clicks feel a lot finer. They just feel overall better quality. Personally, I actually really like the more muted colors on these as well. The other ones are a bit too bright for me. You can tell in my studio, I kind of like darker colors and whatnot. Another big upgrade is the screen. New high-res OLED screen. This is wonderful. It's much brighter than the original. It's much easier to see outside. It's still not going to work very well in bright sunlight, but for partly cloudy days or partly sunny, depending on how you look at it, it's a huge improvement. Especially when you're editing tape, it's a lot easier now. Like the display is kind of flush with the rest of the OP-1 case. So it's easier to see like track number 4. That was kind of a problem in the original one. It was hard to see exactly where it was because the LCD kind of curved right there. Teenage Engineering has also gone through and updated all the graphics for basically everything in it to take advantage of this high resolution screen. which is another great update. As well as they've actually also added labels to a lot of like the effects and synth parameters. So before, you kind of had to guess what a knob controlled when you were controlling a synth or an effect. Like you might be just twisting a wheel in a cow's uterus and you had no idea what the fuck that did. At least now you can see, oh, hey, that's like feedback or chorus depth or something like that. So while I'm generally a fan of having kind of like that hidden knob names or parameter names to kind of to foster exploration and kind of find those happy accidents, it is also very nice being able to know exactly what you're tweaking on this thing now. And I think it's also nice if you are a big fan of the original OP-1, the new graphics and whatnot will make it feel kind of like a new unit. Everything looks just higher res, it looks much better. They've done a great job kind of updating all the user interface to take advantage of that new resolution on the screen. In addition, there's also now an improved microphone. I think this is probably one of the unsung heroes of the OP-1 field. It's actually really good quality. It's much cleaner now. I can record sounds cleanly from further away than the original OP-1. I use it a lot more than I expected I would. So that's a nice improvement. The case itself is a little bit thinner. This actually weighs just a few grams less than the original. But otherwise, for the most part, it's still a really hefty, solid feeling unit. If you've never picked up an OP-1 field before, you might expect it to be kind of light and plasticky feeling, and that's not the case at all, especially with the new field version. In addition to that, we have these really, really awesome new Velcro circles. No, I'm just kidding about that. These are really fucking stupid. I get that, this is cool if you want to stick it to a keyboard or a guitar or whatever Teenage Engineering was thinking, but I really wish they wouldn't have actually pre-attached like these to the unit. It's great if they would have just included them in the box if you need them. For me, all they do is collect dog hair here in my studio, so I don't have much use for them, and I kind of wish they weren't there, but that is something new on the new field unit if that's kind of something you're interested in. And then we have a lot of upgraded functionality as far as inputs and outputs. So we now have USB-C for charging, audio I/O, and MIDI I/O. You can do audio and MIDI both bidirectionally, to and from the unit. It's class compliant still. It can actually be a USB host. You can plug in like a MIDI hub or actually even some audio interfaces if they're class compliant. It's great for things I like using the USB-C port for like sampling from my iPhone or my iPad. I can just plug it right in, it finds them, it connects automatically, and I can just use an app on my iPad to like record samples into the sampler or a drum machine or write to tape. There is kind of one downside though to this new USB-C port, and that is that there's much less functionality when it comes to disk mode on the OP-1. On the original, you could put it in disk mode, connect it to your computer, and you could access all your samples in the synth engine as well as the drum machine, and you could also access your tape recordings, so you could access individual tracks from each recording. As well as the overall mixdown if you recorded to a mixdown. Unfortunately now in the OP-1 field, they connect to your computer via MTP, which is media transfer protocol, if I remember correctly. There is still disk mode on this that lets you access the synth samples and the drum machine samples, but you can no longer get your recordings in disk mode. You have to enter MTP mode, and unfortunately, macOS and iOS, iPadOS doesn't support MTP natively. Teenage Engineering has an applet they created for the desktop for macOS. You have to launch that first, put this in MTP mode, and then it works, as it should. And that's not a problem. That's an easy enough step to do. But unfortunately, there's no way to actually like offload your tracks and any of your recordings onto like say an iPad. And I ran into this as an issue just this past week. I was on vacation, brought the OP-1 with, recorded a lot of songs. And now that we have multiple tapes, which I'll talk about in a second. But I had no way to back those up. Or do like any kind of tweaks to them on my iPad, which was all I had with me. So I think that's kind of a shame. I'm not really sure what the benefit of MTP is on that field versus the original disk mode on the first OP-1. And I really hope they bring that back because it just seems weird to cripple this so drastically when everything else has been improved. Speaking of tapes, that was one of the other annoyances of the first OP-1. You only had one tape to work with. You had 4 tracks that were 6 minutes long, and that was it. If you wrote a song and used all those tracks for all that length, the only way to start another song on the OP-1 was to offload it to your computer, erase all the tape, and then start from scratch, which meant that a lot of people were using like one tape as just like a sketch pad. You'd have like song 1 in the first minute and like song 2 ideas in the second minute. It was a workaround, but it was just kind of a shame that like, you still had to be somewhat tethered to your computer if you wanted to write more than one song at a time with this. Happily, in the OP-1 field, we now have 8 tapes that we can choose and switch between. In addition to that, they've modeled some kind of classic tape styles. You have like a vintage analog 4-track machine, Tascam Porta Studio, and like a Sony Minidisc tape style. In use, all these really do is add different flavors of noise to the recordings as you're recording things. There is still like a studio clean version which doesn't add any noise, and I think most people will probably use that, but you know, you have some other options if you want some more lo-fi gritty sounds. You know, you can use one of those other tape styles. You still only have 8 tapes total, you know, and you have to pick and choose which kind of tape style you want before you actually start a project. But at least that's an option now. You know, you can work on more than one song at a time without having to tether to a computer to do that. One of the things that we like about the OP-1 Field and the OP-1 in general is that your final songs and all your sketches are stored as audio tracks. You know, everything you do gets recorded to those 4 audio tracks in a tape reel, which is great because it kind of frees you up to kind of experiment and play around more with like the sampler or the synth engines. Like say with the OP-Z, if you decide to change your samples in the unit, like any song that you have in their project pattern, the reference to those samples isn't going to work anymore. So, you know, when you first get the OP-Z, or at least what I did, you know, I spent a lot of time picking out just the right samples because they're probably going to stay on there for a long time, if not forever. So I really like on the OP-1 that it kind of encourages me to play around. Like I don't have to feel like, you know, beholden to keeping the same samples I've always had in there. I can freely change it up as I'm working on the unit. And that's great, especially because, as a lot of people know, there's a built-in FM receiver in here, which has also been upgraded. I find that it's a much stronger signal that it gets. It's much cleaner sounding. I can pick up a lot more stations. And it's actually been a lot more fun than I expected to like grab like audio snippets from the radio. Like I said, I was on vacation this past week, and the only station I got was like a country station and like a reggae station, at least at the times I was listening. But it was great. I could resample like this cool reggae bass hits and kind of play with some effects and resample it with the drum track on here. And you know, it was a really great way to kind of add some new samples that I wouldn't have gotten any other way. So I like the fact that, like I said, everything is stored as audio, and you can, you know, it kind of encourages you to like freely like change things up. You're not stuck with the same sounds all the time. In addition to the kind of goes along with that when it comes to sampling. I believe the original drum machine in the OP-1 only had 12-second sampling time. Now we have 20 seconds, if I remember correctly. As well as that, everything in the OP-1 Field is stereo now. So you have a stereo signal path, you have a 32-bit signal path, so it sounds much, much better. A lot of the complaints I had about the original OP-1 being thin and kind of lo-fi are completely gone now. I could do full-on productions using just this. It would sound modern, and I think most people would never know it was on an OP-1, you know, provided you're a good enough musician to kind of pull that thing off. So there's not much limitations about the hardware anymore about how it sounds. It sounds great. They also added a new virtual analog modeled synth, which is really good, as well as a new reverb, the Mother reverb, which sounds amazing. You can get some really warm, long, lush reverbs with that, which is great for like ambient kind of dub techno. So that was another great, really huge improvement over the original OP-1. Kind of the last thing I like about the OP-1, both the original and the Field, is that it really encourages you to live play things. In a way, this is kind of like a downside to it is it's really hard to sync things to a steady clock. I mean, there's some workarounds. There's, as you may know, there's like 7 or 8 different sequencers that you can use to program like drum beats or arpeggios and things like that. But actually syncing those to like your overall recordings can be quite difficult. There's a trick where you can hold down record, and when you first press a key to trigger a sequencer, it will start on beat with the metronome, which is nice. It's a good workaround. And I'm sure a lot of people use that first to get like a steady clock, you know, like a steady drum track to play over. But if you were to like re-trigger a note with the sequencers, especially the finger drummers, which I use a lot, if you're a little bit off timing wise, it doesn't correct that. Like you will be off the rest of the song. So it encourages you to kind of like play freely and use your ear more when it comes to sync. It's really hard to get things completely synced up all the way through a recording, I find, unless you're super, super careful in the beginning. Which is fine with me. I've actually like come to enjoy like having a bit of a looser feel in my songs and just going by ear and not having everything locked to a rigid metronome. So that's kind of another thing for me, at least, that I really like about this. But there are some downsides as well about the OP-1. I think people, especially the new Field version, that I think people should be kind of aware of. Like I mentioned, it's kind of hard to sync like arpeggios and, you know, your sequences to like a steady clock. You know, once you get used to the workarounds and some of the shortcuts for that, it's not too bad, but something to be aware of. Like if you're used to always working with like a steady, rigid metronome and sequence, like coming to this is going to be a bit of a culture shock. Another one of the kind of downsides to this is that while we have multiple tapes now that we can choose and switch between for songs, it's not, you can't think of tapes as like a new project. Like any presets you've saved in the unit, any samples, they'll still be there if you load up a new tape. So it's not like you can have like all completely different samples for each tape. They're global throughout the unit. It's just your recordings that change. When the OP-1 field first came out, it didn't even save your mixer settings per tape. So you had to redo all your mixer levels for every single song you did. Luckily now there's been an update since then. So every time you recall a tape that you've worked on previously, it will recall the mixer settings you used. But one thing it still doesn't recall is actually the master, your master channel settings. So your master EQ, there's a master drive, like compressor, kind of gain, it sounds really nice, as well as just the overall output levels. Those are global as well. So if you want different like master effects, like if you want like a master reverb on one song, but maybe another song you want the cow effect or the punch effect, you have to remember that, make a note of it, and manually dial that back up. So that's kind of one thing I wish they would address. I wish that when we call up a new tape, we at least got new master channel settings as well. But as it is right now, that's not the case. Kind of on that note, one of the other kind of interesting things about the OP-1 field is by default, it's very loud, the signal level. Like the mixer comes, it's all maxed out, like the volumes are all set to 99 out of 100, or actually I think it's just out of 99 is the highest volume you can get. The synths volumes are all maxed out. So even just playing one synth or one sample, it's pretty easy to overload and clip the master channel on the OP-1. So one of the first things I have to do every single project or every single tape I load a new tape is like lower the mixer volumes all down to like 30 or 40 just to give myself some headroom, and turn down. They also by default have like the drive parameter on the master channel. Like I want to turn that down. It sounds fine. It's not like pure distortion. It's more like a compression volume boost at lower volumes, but still you may not always want that. And by default, that's always enabled. So that's, again, just something else to be aware of. I think one of the main downsides to the OP-1 workflow, and this is true even with the field, is that you'll be doing a lot of tape editing, and there's very limited functionality for how you can go about that. There's no fades, there's no crossfades. Zooming in and out can be kind of difficult. You can set like a loop range within your tape to sort of zoom in, but you can't like manually zoom in to really get a fine point. There's no representation of audio files on any of the tapes. It's just an orange bar, a solid bar if something's been recorded on that. And we'll zoom in here in a second. I'll show you what I'm talking about. But it can be kind of tedious, and I think it's something you're going to be using a lot if you get the OP-1 and you're actually recording things with it. So I think, it's something to be aware of, that there are huge limitations in what you can actually edit once it's recorded. So it really forces you to like pay attention while you're recording, especially if you're overdubbing, get your levels right. You only have one effect per track. Per synth or drum actually. You can't really easily apply an effect to a track once it's been recorded. There's some workarounds with like using the master effect and bouncing to tape and then copying it back onto another track and whatnot, but it's kind of long-winded. The other main issue I have with the OP-1 field is, even though there's a new processor in here and we now have 32-bit signal path and stereo recording, some things are painfully slow when it comes to tape editing. Especially if you're lifting and dropping tapes that are longer audio files. Lifting and dropping is basically like cutting and pasting. So you can cut a section of tape and paste it somewhere else. But if you have like a longer section of tape you're cutting, it can take up to like 30, 40 seconds just to lift that up and basically copy it to like a clipboard or like a record buffer. I'm not sure exactly how the OP-1 works. And almost as long to paste it back again. So if you're someone who likes to work fast and you really want to cut and paste and fly around in the interface, you can't really do that in OP-1. You've got to kind of slow down, take your time. As I mentioned, there's no undo. So if you accidentally overwrite something or paste an audio track onto the wrong track or another section of track by mistake, like that's it. You've made a mistake and you have to start over. This actually caught me out yesterday. I was trying to do this review outside initially, and while talking about this, I accidentally had opened up a tape I was working on at the time, a song I was working on that was almost done, and without realizing it, I had actually pressed record and play while I was holding it and recorded over like the main drums for the whole song while I was talking. And again, that's it. There's no way to get that back. So I think you'll find in the OP-1 and again in the OP-1 field, there's a lot of limitations. There's a lot of things people wish would be different, but you have to embrace those. It's all about working within that sandbox, working within those limitations, and not trying to get frustrated by it, like saying, this is what I have to work with. These are my tools. What can I do with it? So if you're a person who can kind of get on with that kind of workflow, I think you're going to bond with the OP-1 very well. If you're somebody who likes really fine detailed editing, you're doing glitchy things, or you just like to see exactly where your slice points are when you're cutting tape, you might get kind of frustrated with the OP-1, and there's no really workarounds for a lot of these things. So I think if you're considering this, I think it would be helpful to watch some YouTube videos, see what the workflow is like, especially the tape editing. And I'll show some of this again close up here in a second, but and see be honest with yourself. Is that something I really want to do all the time? Like, do I want to slow down and like, have a notebook next to me, like take notes, like, oh, I want to cut 4 bars from the beginning of the song and paste them. There's no measure marker, so you can't say it measure 32 easily. You'd have to like start from the beginning of the song and count 32 bars, or write down the time, the tape where you want to drop it. So it just encourages like a more methodical and slower workflow than a lot of people I think will be used to. But again, I think that's kind of what appeals to people about the OP-1. It's just a very different workflow than we're used to today with our modern DAWs and our laptops and all of our iOS devices and whatnot. So before I kind of jump in on, like, I'll show you a little closer what I talk about some of the downsides of tape editing. What do I think about this overall? Like, do I like it? Do I not like it? I'm actually really happy with the field version. It's got the same great workflow from the original OP-1 that I like so much, but the improvements are great all across the board. Like I said, it really does feel and look like a brand new unit. The workflow and, like I said, the layout of everything is the same, but like the build quality feels better. Everything's been improved, from the synth engines to the signal path, like the quality of the keys, the labeling, the display, all the synth engine graphics, like all the graphics actually have been updated. There's probably nothing in this that isn't brand new, and I think they've really taken a lot of the comments people had about the original one and like implement a lot of those things. I think they listened to their customers. Unfortunately, I think the one thing that their customers wanted was a cheaper OP-1, and they obviously raised the price. This is $2,000 now. Do I think it's worth it? Yes, absolutely. I think if you bond with the workflow, I think there's a lot here that you get for the money. And I think that until you actually get one in your hands and kind of realize like how capable it is, you've got multiple synthesizers, multiple drum machines. It's a very easy and quick to use sampler. It's a field recorder. It's a 4-track audio recorder. It's an FM radio if you need that. It does Bluetooth MIDI to your iOS devices, apps that support that anyway. There's just a lot that this thing can do that I think you just wouldn't know about by looking at it. And I think when you get into that kind of workflow, that it's really, it's something you can really appreciate. And I think it definitely, now that the build quality has been improved and it feels super solid, it feels like it's going to, last a very long time. I do definitely think it's worth $2,000. At the same time, I think it's a very divisive workflow. Like I said, there's a lot of limitations. Synths are very basic as far as what parameters they give you. Tape editing is extremely basic, and it's kind of the core workflow of the OP-1 is editing and tape. So if you're not somebody that's going to bond with that, and if you can't like slow down and adapt to that workflow, I think you can be really frustrated. If you're looking at the OP-1 just as like a synthesizer for your studio, I don't think it's worth $2,000 as a synthesizer alone. I think it's kind of the combination of all these things that make it so important. So yeah, I'm very happy with it. I have had some pretty deep sessions with this so far, and got some really cool song ideas I wouldn't have gotten any other way, just because I couldn't lock everything into a strict MIDI clock. I had to kind of play freely. It encouraged me to actually play drums in real time, and I'm not really a finger drummer, but after a couple practices, you could get it down passably, and it gives my songs like a nice organic feel that they wouldn't have had any other way. So I'm actually really curious to kind of see like what else I can do with this, and see how else I can integrate it into kind of my studio workflow for a while. So yeah, that's kind of the wrap up. I'm really happy with it. I think that they made some great improvements. I think for, a lot of people like to bash Teenage Engineering, but I think they actually went and listened to a lot of their customer requests on the original OP-1 and implemented them, and made some really usable, nice improvements to the original workflow, without changing the character of what made the original OP-1 so good in the first place. With that being said, let's kind of dive in. I'll give you one little quick look about the tape editing. If this is something you're considering, I think a lot of people may not understand like how limited that is. So I just wanted to show that one aspect, like how we can edit tape and what some of the downsides are a little closer. But otherwise, yeah, I'm really happy with this. On that, let's go ahead and dive in a little closer. Okay, here we are zoomed in a little bit so you can see some of the tape editing kind of idiosyncrasies I was talking about before. As you can see, you've got four tracks here on the bottom of the screen. Track 1 is empty right now. Track 2, track 3, and track 4 have data on them. You can mute tracks. You can see like the display dims up here with the track number when it's muted. But when it comes to actually editing your tapes, so let's say I'm on track 2. You use the encoder to kind of scroll where you want to do the edit, and then your scissors here, you can cut. Say you made a mistake, you can join those again by holding Shift and scissors. Keep in mind there's no crossfades, there's no fade ins, there's no fade outs. So dealing with clicks and pops and trying to work around those is kind of like one of the things you have to get used to on the OP-1. But you get very limited resolution to see where you're going. There's no easy way to kind of zoom in and get finer detail. You can use it does have like a loop functionality. So I'm going to set a loop in point there and then a loop out point there. And it'll zoom a little bit based on what your loop length is. But that's about it. You can't really like zoom in and get finer detail of what you're editing. And like I said, there's no display, there's no waveform display anyway, so you're doing it all by ear. You can kind of increase the resolution. These vertical lines right now are showing measure lines, so it's every bar, these little vertical lines with the track. You can change that to finer resolution, half bars, quarter bars, eighth bars, but that's about it. And you could snap your playhead cursor, where you do all your editing, to these lines by holding shift and arrow back and forth. So let's go back to 1 bar, just so you can see I can move through the project this way. So you get very limited like control of like zooming in and doing really precise edits. One of the downsides of that, obviously, is if you have a good take and just want to get a bum note out, it can be very, very tedious. Something I'm going to keep saying over and over again. But the flip side of that, a good thing, is that it encourages you to actually record your performances right the first time around. It's so much easier to just like, oh, hey, I made a mistake recording like a bass line in a song. I'll just stop, delete it, and start over and just try to play it perfectly, or as perfectly as I can, versus like trying to cut and paste and fix notes and like, chop together a performance. Like the OP-1, it's doable, but you're going to hate yourself if you try to work like that all the time. It's just going to be really slow. One of the other things to be aware of when it comes to like working with tape editing is just navigating around your tape. Like I said, the tapes are all 6 minutes long. You can hold stop and press left arrow to go to the beginning of the tape, stop and hold right arrow to go to the end of the tape. But say you want to go like to minute 3 to do an edit there, or to start recording like halfway through the song. The only way to get there is to like hold forward, and you can hold play to kind of speed it up a little bit. But this is it. You've got to kind of hold this down, or you can turn the encoder for finer resolution. But yeah, if you're trying to get to like minute 3, you've got to kind of sit here and wait and wait and wait. We're halfway there. So again, just something to be aware of when it comes to like, editing workflow on the OP-1. It's simple. It's very, very basic. And you have to embrace that and find it something that you really like to do. Otherwise, you're just going to get frustrated with this. One more thing I want to show, and I think a lot of people, if you've used the OP-1, kind of are aware of this. Like I said, there's no easy way. If I'm just recording, let's say, hang on, let me mute this. Let's say on track 1, I want to record some drums, right? So I press record and play, and I've got like a drum sequencer here. I've got the finger drummer. But see, you can trigger this whenever you want. It doesn't actually sync to the tempo you have set for your OP-1 project. There is kind of a workaround that you can do, is that if you line up the cursor with a bar, so it holds shift and go this way. So let's say I want to start on measure 2. I want my drums to start. I can hold record and then press any key. This works for the synths or the drum machines, and it won't actually start recording until I press the key. So this is kind of the workaround to sync things up. So now the drums are in time with the project tempo. Everything lines up with the bar measures, which makes cutting and pasting a lot easier. I think a lot of people probably who work with the OP-1 do this kind of procedure first, just to get the timing right. But let's say you want to trigger another sequence in the finger drummer. So you can hear that when I press another key, that new key that I just pressed is not synced to the tempo. So every time you change patterns or sequences, you have to make sure your timing is right on, because it won't do it for you. Again, that's not really always a bad thing. Once you kind of get used to that, if you just learn to almost ignore like the tempo markers, or the BPM markers, just record freely and just overdub by ear, like it can actually be pretty freeing, not being tied to a rigid clock anymore, provided you like that looseness. But again, it's just something I wanted to point out. Not everyone's aware of that. Let's step back and I will give you my final thoughts on the OP-1 field. Thanks. All right, so that was a bit of a closer look on some of the tape editing functionality, or more than likely the lack of functionality that you might have to deal with if you get the OP-1. Like I said, I'm really happy with this. I think Teenage Engineering did a great job. It keeps the same feel and vibe of the original OP-1, just improves on it in every single way, from the physical aspects and the build quality, all the improvements they made there, to the increased sound quality. Now it's a very modern update to the OP-1, and I think it's well worth the price. Would I recommend it for everybody? No, not everyone's going to bond with this kind of workflow, but if it's something that's appealing to you, like, I would definitely recommend, taking a look a little deeper at it. Maybe you can find a used one on Reverb, that kind of thing. So you might have to go full in on $2,000. I know I got mine used on Reverb, actually. It was only used for like a month, and the original owner didn't really bond with it, and I got it for like $500 off. So $1,500 for this, I think, is more than worth it. So keep an eye out for deals. They're out there on some really awesome mint condition units. You don't necessarily have to pay $2,000 to kind of experience the OP-1 workflow. So that's it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll get to them as soon as I can. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next video. Thanks.